Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Danny and Rocco, two inseparable teenage friends, had always found joy in their aimless adventures. For them, every outing was a chance to discover something new in Port Charles, whether it was the winding alleys of the old town or the quiet nooks along the coastline. They reveled in the freedom that youth brought, never worrying about the consequences of their actions. Each day, they created their own little world, where they were the rulers of their domain, carefree and boundless. From secretive jaunts to the edge of the town to rebellious moments of reckless abandon, they cherished their adventures, always eager to explore the unknown, pushing the boundaries of what was safe and familiar. On this particular afternoon, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the peaceful waters of Port Charles. The sound of the waves gently lapping against the shore was soothing, the kind of serene atmosphere that usually meant calm, untroubled days. Danny and Rocco, as always, were on one of their many spontaneous walks along the pier, content in their shared silence as they watched the boats sway on the water. The salty air filled their lungs, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them had paused, offering them a brief respite from the complexities of life. But the calm was deceptive, as it often is in life, and this particular day would soon prove to be one of the most jarring moments in both their young lives. While strolling near the edge of the pier, Danny's sharp eyes caught sight of something odd. Something wasn't right. A strange shape seemed to be floating on the water, barely visible against the glowing backdrop of the setting sun. At first, it seemed like just another piece of driftwood, caught in the tide, but as they both drew closer, the horrific truth slowly dawned upon them. It wasn't wood, nor any other natural debris. It was a body. A lifeless, floating figure, bobbing gently with the current, its cold, pallid skin stark against the glistening water. The face, obscured by the dark water beneath, remained motionless, devoid of any signs of life. A wave of shock swept over them as they stared, rooted to the spot. The world seemed to fall silent, save for the rhythmic crash of the waves against the pier. Time seemed to slow as the boys, who had never imagined witnessing something so horrifying, stood frozen in place. Their hearts pounded in their chests, each beat heavy with disbelief and growing fear. The sight before them was not something they could have ever prepared for, and the realization of what they were witnessing began to settle uneasily in their minds. This wasn't a harmless discovery. This was something dark, something tragic, and perhaps, something dangerous. Danny's throat tightened, his words stuck somewhere between shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak but found no sound coming out. Rocco, equally stricken, stared at the figure in front of them, his mind racing, trying to piece together what had happened. How had the body ended up here? Who was it? The unanswered questions flooded their thoughts, each one more chilling than the last. There was no sign of injury or struggle, but the unnatural stillness of the body told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't just an accident, something sinister had taken place. Danny, breaking the silence, was the first to react. His instincts kicked in, and despite the panic surging within him, he urged Rocco to call the police. But the sound of his own voice, shaky and uncertain, only served to heighten the sense of urgency between them. They both knew that their next steps were critical. This wasn't a discovery they could keep to themselves. But there was something else gnawing at them. The eerie quiet of the scene, the way the body seemed almost too still, too perfectly placed, made them question if it was really just a simple drowning. Or was it something more? Something far more deliberate. With trembling hands, Rocco pulled out his phone and dialed for help. The call was brief, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. Soon, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and in that moment, the two teens understood that their lives, which had once felt simple and carefree, had just collided with something much darker. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, the thoughts swirling in their minds were a chaotic blur. The body, drifting on the water, seemed to be mocking their innocence, a stark reminder that even the most peaceful of places could harbor deadly secrets. How would they explain what they had seen? How could they make sense of it? Unbeknownst to them, the events of that day would set off a chain reaction in Port Charles that would ripple through the lives of those around them. They had no idea yet, but this was just the beginning. The discovery of this body would soon intertwine their fates with those of the adults in their town, the tangled webs of betrayal, revenge, and dark secrets that none of them were prepared for. The body, floating quietly on the surface, was the catalyst for something far greater than either Danny or Rocco could ever have imagined. As the police arrived and began their investigation, the questions mounted. Was this just a tragic accident, or had something far more sinister occurred? And as the answers slowly began to unfold, it became clear that the small, seemingly inconsequential lives of two teenagers were now irrevocably linked to a mystery that would change the course of Port Charles forever. The moment Danny and Rocco made their discovery, everything seemed to freeze. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear their eyes away from the floating body in the water. The reality of the situation crashed over them like a wave, and without thinking, they turned and sprinted back to their homes, their hearts pounding with fear and confusion. Their minds were reeling, processing what they had just witnessed. They had seen death, no, not just death, but something far darker. Something deliberate. As they rushed through the streets, their legs moved on instinct, their adrenaline pushing them forward. But every step was weighed down by the horror of what they had discovered. Once they arrived at home, they were breathless, desperate to tell someone, anyone. Their hands shook as they dialed the police, their voices frantic as they explained the situation. Despite the urgency in their words, neither of them could shake the image of the lifeless body from their minds. Who was the man they had found? Why had he been left there, floating on the water like some discarded thing? The questions swirled in their heads, each one more unsettling than the last. They felt a strange mix of dread and guilt, as if their very discovery had triggered something dangerous. What had they gotten themselves into? While they waited for the authorities to arrive, the unease gnawed at them, refusing to let go. The images of that cold, empty face haunted them, and no matter how hard they tried to focus on something else, it felt like the world had narrowed down to that single, horrifying moment. They couldn't go back to the carefree days of their youth. Not after what they had seen. They knew, deep down, that their lives would never be the same again. The moment they called the police, they had unknowingly set off a chain of events that would forever alter the course of their future. Meanwhile, as Danny and Rocco were caught in their own personal nightmare, Port Charles was bracing itself for a storm of its own. At the same time, Ava Jerome, Rick Lansing, and Christina Corinthos Davis found themselves locked in an increasingly volatile psychological battle, one that no one could have predicted, but one that would soon unravel the lives of everyone involved. The tension between these three individuals had been building for months, but it reached a boiling point during a seemingly innocent meeting at Alexis Davis's house. What had started as a discussion quickly devolved into something much darker. Ava, who had always been calculating and cold, found herself on the edge of a breakdown. She was no longer the confident, poised woman everyone had come to know. Rick had pushed her to the brink. The man she had once loved, the man she had once trusted, had betrayed her once again. It wasn't just that he had lied to her or manipulated her. It was that he had done it to hurt her, to destroy the last remnants of trust between them. The argument began innocently enough, but it didn't take long for things to escalate. The words that passed between them were sharp, each one a dagger thrown to wound the other. Ava accused Rick of all the wrongs he had committed, each accusation more damning than the last. Rick, ever the manipulator, fought back with equal venom, twisting every word to suit his own narrative. He had his own set of grievances, of course, but what was more telling was the way he spoke, like someone who had no care for the destruction he was causing. Ava's fury was palpable. She could feel the anger rising inside her, an uncontrollable force that was quickly overtaking her rationality. She had always been able to keep her emotions in check, but now, with Rick's cold, dismissive attitude, she was losing her grip. His words were like acid, eating away at her, and the more he spoke, the more she felt herself unraveling. Then, in a moment of pure rage, Ava grabbed the nearest object within reach, an ornate decorative object from Alexis's coffee table, a heavy metal sculpture that looked more like an abstract piece of art than anything dangerous. But in her hands, it became a weapon. With one swift motion, she swung it at Rick, striking him hard in the head. The impact was so intense that Rick crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Christina, who had been standing by, a mere observer at first, now found herself thrust into the middle of the chaos. She had watched the argument unfold, helpless, unable to stop the train wreck of emotions that was happening right before her eyes. At first, she had thought she could stay out of it, but now, as she stood frozen in the room with Ava standing over the fallen Rick, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Ava's anger was terrifying, and Christina realized with a sinking heart that she was caught in the middle of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Christina's mind raced. She couldn't deny that she had a complicated history with both Ava and Rick. Ava, in particular, was someone she had always been wary of, someone who had crossed lines in the past and seemed capable of anything. But the act of violence she had just witnessed was a different story. This wasn't just an argument gone wrong. This was something far more calculated, far more dangerous. And it was clear to Christina that Ava was no longer the woman she once thought she knew. Ava wasn't just angry, she was desperate, willing to do anything to regain control of a situation that had spiraled out of her grasp. Christina stood in shock, unable to speak, her mind unable to process the scene before her. Ava, noticing her frozen stance, turned to her, her eyes dark and filled with an intensity that made Christina shudder. It was then that Christina realized she had just become part of something much larger than she could have ever anticipated. Ava was no longer just a woman consumed by anger, she was a woman capable of committing terrible acts to protect herself and her secrets. Ava turned to Christina, her voice low and threatening. She knew that Christina had witnessed everything, and she was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that Christina wouldn't speak up. There were too many secrets, too many things Ava had done that she needed to keep buried. If Christina were to tell anyone what she had seen, it would all come crashing down, and Ava couldn't allow that to happen. And so, the unthinkable happened. Ava, once again, manipulated Christina into her web of deceit. With a combination of threats and promises, Ava coerced Christina into helping her cover up the crime. Ava was no stranger to using her power to get what she wanted, and now Christina was caught in her grasp, unable to break free. It was clear that Ava would stop at nothing to protect herself and her secrets, even if it meant dragging Christina down with her. As Christina reluctantly agreed to help Ava, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building inside her. The lines between right and wrong had become blurred, and there was no turning back now. She had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The consequences of her actions were still unknown, but one thing was certain, nothing in Port Charles would ever be the same again. The lives of everyone involved were about to be irrevocably changed, and there was no way to predict how deep this rabbit hole would go. The argument between Ava and Rick escalated rapidly, each harsh word cutting deeper than the last. The once civil tone of the conversation had long since vanished, replaced by sharp, venomous exchanges that reverberated through the room like a storm in full force. Rick's insults grew bolder, and Ava's frustration reached its boiling point. She had always prided herself on her control, on being the one who could manipulate any situation to her advantage, but this time, Rick had crossed a line that she could no longer tolerate. His smug demeanor and careless words tore at the last thread of Ava's patience, and the facade of cool detachment she had cultivated for years shattered in an instant. Her fingers twitched with anger, eyes blazing with fury as she scanned the room, looking for something, anything, to release her pent-up rage. Her gaze landed on a large pearl, an exquisite piece of decor that had been carelessly placed on the coffee table. It was a beautiful item, elegant and calm, a symbol of wealth and sophistication. But in Ava's hands, it became something far more dangerous. Without thinking, she grabbed the pearl, her grip tightening as she swung it toward Rick with all her strength. The sharp crack of the pearl against Rick's skull echoed in the room, and Rick's body crumpled to the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head as he fell unconscious. Christina, who had been standing frozen by the doorway, was rooted to the spot in shock. The entire scene unfolded before her like a nightmare she could not escape from. She had never seen her mother like this, never seen Eva lose control in such a violent, explosive way. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Eva had struck Rick. Eva had physically harmed him, and he was now lying on the floor, motionless, his life hanging by a thread. Christina's thoughts were tangled. Her loyalty to her mother, Alexis, was something she had held onto for so long, but now, she found herself standing between two worlds. On one hand, there was her mother, Eva, the woman she had always known as fierce and unyielding. But on the other, there was the law, her mother's conscience, and the world outside that would judge them both for what had just happened. She had been raised to protect her family at all costs, but could she really help the woman who had just taken a life in cold blood? Christina's heart raced with confusion, torn between the need to do what was right and the suffocating loyalty she had to her mother. She could hear her own breath in the back of her throat, each intake of air feeling harder and harder to manage. As Christina stood there, frozen in the moment, Eva turned her gaze to her with a cold, calculating look. Eva's eyes, usually sharp and composed, now glinted with something far more dangerous, desperation. She knew the stakes. She knew that Christina was the key to covering up everything. Christina, Eva's voice was a low whisper, but it carried an ominous weight. You saw everything. You saw what I did, and you saw him, Rick, he won't stop. He's always been a threat, and now, he's a liability. Do you want that on your conscience? Eva's words were like venom, each syllable calculated to make Christina feel as though there was no way out. Christina's breath hitched as Eva stepped closer, her presence looming over her. If you don't help me, if you don't cover for me, everything will come crashing down. I'll make sure everyone knows about your little accident. Eva's smile was thin, cruel, and filled with malice. She knew exactly how to push Christina's buttons, how to remind her of the darkest corners of her past. Eva wasn't just threatening Christina with her own safety, she was threatening to destroy her entire life. Christina had always been afraid of the truth coming to light, and now Eva was dangling that truth in front of her like a sword over her head. The accident Eva referred to was something Christina had tried to bury deep in her memories, a terrible secret she had worked tirelessly to keep hidden. Months ago, Christina had been involved in the near-fatal crash that had left Rick and Elizabeth Baldwin injured. Christina had made a choice, an impulsive, reckless choice, and had cut the brake lines of Rick's car. It was a moment she would forever regret, but it had been done in a moment of intense emotion. She never meant for it to go this far, but the consequences of that single action were now coming to light. The thought of her own involvement in that accident, her part in Rick's suffering, made her stomach churn. But now, Eva had evidence, and Christina was no longer in control. I have the proof, Christina, Eva continued, her voice low but piercing. I know what you did. You think no one noticed. You think you're safe. Eva paused, letting her words hang in the air like a deadly threat. If you don't help me hide what's happened here, if you don't clean up this mess, I'll make sure that the world knows everything about your involvement in that crash. I'll make sure your life is ruined. The reality of Eva's threat hit Christina like a physical blow. She felt trapped, cornered, and utterly powerless. What choice did she have? She couldn't afford for her secret to be exposed. The shame, the guilt, it would destroy everything she had worked for. Her relationship with Alexis, the future she had hoped for, everything was on the line. Eva, with her cold manipulation and ruthless tactics, had her completely in her grip. Christina's gaze dropped to the unconscious Rick, her stomach twisting in knots. What had she just witnessed? What had her mother just done? Eva wasn't just a woman driven by anger, she was a woman capable of destroying lives without a second thought. And now, Christina had become a part of her plan, unwillingly drawn into a dark web of crime and deceit. Ava's hand gently cupped Christina's chin, lifting her face so their eyes met. "You will help me, Christina," she said softly, but there was no mistaking the finality in her voice. "If you don't, your life will be over. You'll never be able to look your mother in the eye again." Christina, her mind whirling, felt the weight of her options pressing down on her. Ava's threat wasn't an empty one, it was real. If she didn't comply, if she didn't help cover up this crime, everything she had worked to protect would crumble. The people she loved, her future, her reputation, all of it would be destroyed. With a resigned sigh, Christina nodded, her heart sinking as she gave in to Ava's demands. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the last remnants of her innocence slipping away. Ava's smile widened, cold and triumphant. "Good girl. I knew you would come around." And just like that, Christina was pulled into the darkness, bound by secrets, guilt, and the fear of losing everything she had ever known.